Hello to all our viewers on Indie Live Extra YouTube channel. We do try and bring you extra little bits in addition to our broadcast shows and our podcast. So what we have here is 5 interesting clips from a discussion with Alf Baird, who's an expert on marine economy. And they're all to do with Scotland's ports, Scotland's economy, what happened to the ROSYTH ferry. Ferry's very topical just now, and he's got some thoughts on what would be a good ferry design. So they're only about 5 minutes each. Hope you enjoy them.
We had in the 1990s, well, with the Thatcher era, of course, a completely different ideology coming in, using Friedman economics, which were misinterpreted largely. But the legal aspect, it was first of all changed with the Ports Act in 1991, which allowed the ports to privatize. Before that, we had trust ports. Trust ports also are a bit of an alien concept as far as Scotland's concerned. and the literature historically going back into trust port mechanisms and models is that trust ports were also a mechanism for acting in the interests of trustees, if you like. So the interception of economic rents was always there for ports and certain port interests that were able to exploit their monopolies. So trust ports were not the ideal model. They were established by Acts of Parliament for Forth, Clyde, Tay, and for many others in Scotland that still exist, Aberdeen, Lerwick, and so on, Invergordon. So we have a mixed legacy of port legal aspects, but the Ports Act in 1991 essentially allowed trust ports to bring forward privatisation schemes, and very quickly Forth, Clyde, and Tay were privatised. And Forth subsequently floated on the London stock market. Clyde Port bought by a management buyout team who quickly became multimillionaires and then sold on the port to the next owner. And then subsequently the port was acquired by Peel Ports of Liverpool, or rather Channel Islands ownership. So it's an offshore equity fund. So essentially these ports became owned by offshore private equity funds. The problem is that the ports are split into 3 functions in terms of the legality of them. The first is they are landowners. The second aspect is they are operators of all the activities within the port. And the third aspect is they are regulators, regulators of the navigation, regulators of new port developments, and they have the ability to tax shipping and trade. So every ton of trade and every ton of ship coming into the Forth, Clyde, or Tay can be taxed. And they are taxed by, at the moment, offshore private equity funds that own them. So it means that all the money earned through this taxation on shipping and trade is leaked out of the economy. And just to give you some idea of the kind of losses involved in that, where you do have municipal-owned ports in Scotland are at Shetland and Orkney. Sullom Voe is the big oil terminal in Shetland, owned by BP, but it's regulated by the council. As a port authority, Shetland Islands Council. And in Orkney, the Sullom Voe oil terminal is administered, regulated by the Port Authority, which is a department also of the council in Orkney. And these are the 2 councils that have been able to build up massive oil fund reserves, if you like. And it's basically from the ability to tax tankers. So all the tankers that have come into Shetland and Orkney over the last 30, 40 years have been levied a tax on them, and the councils have gathered that up and stuck them in the bank account and build up their multi-million-pound reserve funds, which they still use today for various social goods. Alternatively, on the Forth and Clyde, the oil tankers and other ships, all the taxes levied on these ships has simply been extracted out of Scotland, and therefore the local communities have not gained access to that at all, one single bit. And in the case of Hound Point on the Forth, that is probably into the billions of pounds extracted over the last 30 years by Forth ports. The end result, of course, of this is, as well as the piecemeal redevelopment of docklands, whether it's Clyde, Forth, Tay, and so on, we've also had the lack of emphasis on creating new port infrastructure for Scotland. And this is a bit of a bugbear for me because this is areas that I've actually done quite a lot of research in, showing where we should have new ports. For example, in Cockenzie at the former power station, and also the development of the Scapa Flow project, Hunterston's another one that's not been developed properly as it could have been due to Clyde-Port ownership changing to Peel. Scotland, in a sense, is in this an underdeveloped situation. I liken it to a colonial kind of reality where the system is not developed. The port system in Scotland is not developed to enhance Scotland's competitiveness globally. The port system in Scotland and the economy largely is just there to develop and to support the core nation, as it were, the needs of the core nation, which is the UK, or rather England. And most of the port developments we see are in the south of England. And we don't see the same impetus or incentive to develop anything north of the border, which means that our ports are in a dire state now, no longer relevant to much of modern shipping, and therefore no longer attractive to modern shipping, and also very expensive because the private equity funds tend to have very high tariffs that chase business away. So it's actually chasing trade and shipping away. Therefore, I think the conclusion to all this is that we actually need in Scotland a modern maritime policy. And this has been drafted by myself and Roy Peterson before, and it was given to the SNP Westminster group. In fact, they commissioned it. But as soon as they showed it to civil servants, they jumped up and down and said, "Oh, you can't do that." So the problem is, of course, that the Scottish government, Holyrood, is still working to a London agenda on transport policy internationally. And that transport policy internationally, in a sense, is to leave the ports as they are, to leave the Thatcher legacy as it is, to leave the exploitation to continue for the foreseeable future. And these estuarial monopolies are comprehensive and very complete, and they are inhibiting Scotland's trade and constraining Scotland's economic development. So the only thing one can conclude here is that probably independence is the only thing that can change this philosophy, assuming, of course, you get different policymakers coming into the civil service and so on that understands a bit about policy and shipping. I have to say, just to finish, that most of the projects I worked on, in European projects with port operators and port policymakers, it was quite obvious that the civil servants on the continent were quite often had education in port policy, port economics. Often they had PhDs, doctorates in port development policies and shipping policy and so on. Whereas our civil servants here in Scotland, none of them seem to have that expertise. They don't have an understanding of the importance of seaports and how they can make or break an economy. And that's very important. So ports are really, on the continent, they're regarded as engines of the economy, where you facilitate trade. But there is an understanding as well where you lose control of ports and give it to the offshore private equity groups, then that can really constrain an economy's growth and development. And that's largely where we are at the moment. Bear in mind that ports can make or break an entire country's economy. And where we give away our ports to the private equity funds offshore, they can completely destroy our economy through that mechanism. And that's also why most countries, in fact, all other countries outside the UK, even the United States, don't adopt this model. This model, the ports are regarded as utilities, but they're also regarded as strategic for the economic sustenance of the entire country, for the import and export of everything, but also for defense and other purposes. There is the aspect that ports, major ports particularly, are public goods. And this is well understood in economics, for port economics globally. Ports are utilities, essential utilities for a people to survive. The difficulty with port investment being done by the private sector is that port investment tends to be very, very lumpy. It's very, very big, lumpy investment to create a new seaport. It's very long term. A port investment will last centuries. So these are things that the private sector are not generally able to undertake. long-term lumpy investments like this. Private sector, especially offshore private equity funds, are looking for returns after 6 or 8 years, not after 50 years or 100 years. So this is why we don't see any new ports in Scotland or large-scale ports serving international markets, is because we've relied on the private sector to do it. And globally, the private sector don't do that. It's the public sector, the state, that has to finance and proceed with planning for large-scale, long-term port investments, basically because they're very lumpy, very long-term. Private equity funds don't do that. All private equity funds do is come along and buy a public asset like Forth Ports and Clydeport, sweat it for a few years, milk it for all they're worth, and then run away and sell it to another private equity fund to do the same again. So the private equity model is not sustainable for any economy, because you never get new ports. You never see really new infrastructure unless the public sector come in and co-finance it, like the Greenock cruise terminal or Ardrossan, all of which are owned by Peel Ports, but the Peel Ports have their hand out for the state to invest in new ferry terminals at Ardrossan, for Calmac, and also for cruise terminal at Greenock, and any other facility on the river that they might want to develop. They're looking for public money, and the same as Forth Ports on the Forth, looking for the Freeport or Greenport money, £50 million up for grabs, which will help them to develop a couple of terminals in Leith, perhaps. So essentially, the economic aspects of ports globally are well understood outside Scotland and the UK as being essential. The role of the public sector is absolutely vital in providing seaports because of their lumpiness and the long-term nature, and also very high cost. In fact, when I was a shipping agent in Leith in the 70s, we were wanting to get a direct ferry service to the continent, but various problems appeared in this. The Superfast project was interesting because it developed through, basically my proposal to Scottish Enterprise was to run a tender. Previous to 1990, well, in the 1990s, the Scottish government, or the Scottish office at the time before devolution, their argument was that Scotland's best prospect for connections to Europe was to improve the roads to Hull. And this was the view of civil servants in Edinburgh. And of course, the Port of Hull loved this, because then they could market North Sea ferries from Hull as the gateway to Scotland's gateway to the continent. And they did that very effectively. But I managed to convince Scottish Enterprise to run with a tender. And a tender was, for a European ferry service, was quite common, was starting to become more common on the continent, especially in the Mediterranean, where Mediterranean countries were, if they wanted a ferry service between Italy and Spain, they'd just run a tender and select one, and maybe give a little bit startup funds to do it. So we ran a tender, and we selected Superfast ferries. I was part of the selection panel, fortunately, and we selected Superfast ferries, and they provided a world-class solution. 2 100 million euro ships in 2002 started the route May 17th. And it was amongst great fanfare, but it wasn't contracted under what the European Commission advocate is under their motorways of the sea policy. Governments can actually contract these motorways of the sea like you contract a motorway on the road, and by giving an 8 or a 10-year contract to a provider of the capacity, the ferries in this case, the motorway on the sea, as it were. We could have contracted that, and we should have done so, and that was my suggestion, but they didn't do that. They just let Superfast run the service. The problem with Superfast's operation, however, was mainly related to the port of ROSYTH, and that related to the fact that there wasn't sufficient storage facilities at ROSYTH for freight and for trade cars. And Superfast wanted to carry a lot more trade, a lot more freight, a lot more trade cars, but they didn't have the space at ROSYTH. They weren't given enough space at ROSYTH to do that. It has quite narrow aprons. The second factor was that the private port owner, kept on increasing the port charges. So every year the port charges went up and up and up, and eventually Superfast decided enough was enough, and that's when they put some of their vessels on other routes elsewhere. One was between Finland and Germany, Sweden and Germany, and the other they sold to the French State Line to run on the Channel route. So the problems were really mainly to do with the port and the fact that Scottish government didn't introduce a contract on that route as they could have done under the EU Motorways of the Sea policy, which I have to say I helped draft with my Spanish colleagues and other colleagues, some of whom did actually a PhD on the subject with me. But the Motorways of the Sea policy is still there for member states and neighbouring countries to align together and to tender ferry services between international ferry services between member states and neighbouring countries, and to provide them with support, financial support, which could be several million euros a year. Road transport is, for freight anyway, is provided free in the sense that the roads are free, whereas the motorway of the sea has to be provided by the ship owner. So there's not a level playing field in that sense. And rail as well is heavily subsidised for the infrastructure. So sea transport is not subsidised, but it is allowable under the Motorways of the Sea policy. So that's what should have happened. The Scottish Government, however, has refused to provide any financial support for this, and we're stuck with ROSYTH. I should mention that the Cockenzie development, which I've supported for a long time, having first studied it back in the 1990s for Scottish Power as a cruise and ferry port, the Cockenzie port would have been much prepared by Superfast and would have been done, I think, had the power station not been given a reprieve, because the power station at Cockenzie was due to close before 2000 under EU law, but was given a reprieve for another decade or so. So that's the only reason the Superfast ferry service or the ROSYTH terminal was developed for ferries. The ROSYTH terminal is problematic also because it's much further upriver, and it is subject to shallower channel depth, and the bridge clearance is quite low. So that's why big cruise ships can't use ROSYTH. It's too far up, and it's under a low bridge or 3 low bridges. So if you have a bridge clearance there of about 42, 43 meters, and some cruise ships and even ferries going well over 50 meters, so it can't go under the bridge. It's not ideal. And the extra steaming trip upriver was not helpful to Superfast in terms of profitability. But essentially, Superfast did make a profit after the 4 or 5 years of operations. They were making a profit. They were carrying a large number of people, cars and freight. But the problem was the port infrastructure was limited. The port charges were too high, and the government didn't put in place a proper Motorways of the Sea contract. Well, where I am actually in Orkney, we have Pentland Ferries, who has twice now bought a low-cost catamaran, medium-speed steel catamaran from Asia. And these vessels operate extremely effectively, and they cost about 25% of a CalMac ship. So what I've suggested successively and repeatedly to ministers and committees over the last 20 years and more, and even in studies done for the Scottish Government, paid for by them, is they need to think slightly differently here and specify vessels that are exactly what islands need rather than what stakeholders tell them they need. So we have this bizarre situation where we're actually building ships. I've compared it to the case where we could actually go to a showroom and buy a nice Ford Fiesta that's one of millions of Ford Fiestas. Or we could go and design a completely new car and go to somebody and say, build this completely new car, untested, unproven, and extremely heavy, extremely costly. And that's essentially what we're doing. We're designing a new car every time CalMac want a new ship. And they don't need to do that. They can just go to an established naval architect that's built, say, standard vehicle ferries under 100 meters long, and get them off the shelf, and even buy them from Asia if they want to. The thing is, one of the best designers of ferries is actually a Scotsman globally. He's one of the best designers. He's based in Brisbane, Stuart Ballantyne, and he's built probably about 100 ferries. He's building 30 at the moment for the Philippines. Just these catamaran we have in Orkney that runs on the Pentland Firth, one of the worst sea routes in Scotland, all year round. And these can be built, as I say, for about 1/4 the price of a CalMac ship. and they operate very efficiently. And the people on Arran, the people on Mull, I've been helping them in the last couple of years try to determine a better ferry service, because they're struggling now with what the ships they have are collapsing technologically and age-wise. They're just no longer suitable at all, not providing a decent service. So these island groups are actually pleading with ministers to buy these better low-cost vessels that are being churned out of Chinese and Filipino and also Indonesian shipyards. And there has been the offer made to build these under license at Ferguson's, but that's been declined by Scottish ministers. And Scottish ministers instead and civil servants have put in place people at Ferguson's that have no expertise in ferry construction, no expertise really in shipbuilding in that sense. The previous turnaround director at Ferguson's had no shipyard experience, no ferry experience. The current chief executive, I think, has come from a yacht building background, no ferry experience. So it doesn't augur well. I don't see anything changing. It's just very bad managerial decision making, extremely bad decisions on ship design by Scottish government agencies, which ministers, you could say ministers are responsible for, but they just rubber stamp these decisions that are made by civil servants and officials. So I think what's really lacking is some managerial expertise from shipping, from real expertise. All I can do is a student of global shipping for half a century almost. I started very young. Is highlight what other places do, and the cemetery of shipyards is absolutely full of companies that got it wrong. There's only a few companies get it right, and it's very important we look at these companies who got it right. And the fact is, I say we have one of the best ship designers in the world as a Scotsman, Scots-Australian, and we've just ignored him continually. Yet his vessels are world-beating, and his design is just disregarded by the likes of Calmac and others. So I think it's managerially, it's just, I don't know what the weakness is. The union drives the specification to some extent. Calmac then make the specification, it goes to the ship supplier, CMAL, the Scottish government then fund it, and therefore you have this mechanism but within that is tremendous wastage in overall money terms, and it doesn't deliver a solution because the current fleet is aging. And also we have in Scotland, well, we actually need more than about 100 ferries, I've estimated. A lot of the ferry services we have are underprovided. Where you have one or two vessels, you could easily have 3 or 4. And we have best practice examples like Western Ferries at Gourock Dunoon. 4 ferries, low-cost ferries, operate really effectively. Pentland Ferries on the Pentland Firth. So we have private sector examples showing the government the error of their way on procurement, ship operations, strategies, managerial issues. But the state can sometimes get things very wrong.
Yes, indeed. And if you do enjoy them, then you can find the whole of the talk
on our Mibby's Eye show, which is on Independence Live's YouTube channel, or you can get the podcast version wherever you get your podcasts.
Yep. Good. Have a listen.